On my 105th birthday, no one came. My oldest son sent $200 like settling a bill. My second son called for 3 minutes, his TV louder than his voice. My daughter mailed a card with 4 empty words, "Oops, you dad." That was it. A lifetime of sacrifice reduced to numbers, noise, and silence. I sat there with cold coffee, staring at everything they gave me and everything they didn't. No anger, just clarity. After 60 years, I finally remembered what I had hidden and why none of them were ever meant to have it. I am glad you stayed. Before this story begins, I have one request. Leave a comment below with where you are watching from, your city, your country. You might be surprised how many people are sitting in the same silence you are. Note, this story uses fictional elements for narrative and educational purposes. Similarities to names or places are coincidental. What it has to say, however, is not. The morning I turned 105 years old, the first sound I heard was a pipe knocking somewhere inside the wall. Not a phone call, not a knock at the door, not footsteps on the stairs coming to surprise me with something warm from the kitchen. Just a pipe, indifferent and reliable the way old things tend to be. I lay still for a moment, the way I always do now, taking inventory before I move. That is something nobody tells you about getting very old. You do not just get up anymore. You take stock first. You check what hurts, what has gone numb overnight, whether the room is making sense the way rooms are supposed to. At 105, getting out of bed in the morning is a quiet negotiation between what you want to do and what your body is willing to agree to on any given day. My hearing aids were on the nightstand, right where I leave them every night. Without them, the world reduces itself to a low, underwater hum. Voices become shapes, not words. I put them in before I do anything else. I sat on the edge of the mattress. I breathed once. Then I stood up slow. The stairs at my house on Perrysville Avenue have a railing on both sides. I put both hands on it going down. I am not too proud to say so. 105 years does something particular to your knees that no amount of determination can fully argue with. 11 steps from the top, landing to the kitchen floor. Right foot first, then the left follows. I know each one of those steps by feel, now the way you know a thing you have done 10,000 times without ever meaning to memorize it. It was the 14th of October, and the morning light through the kitchen window had that thin, pale quality Pittsburgh gets when summer has finally let go and fall has moved in for good. Not cold enough to see your breath inside, but close. The kind of light that comes in sideways and lands on everything gently, like it is not sure it is welcome. I put the coffee on the same way I have for 60 years. Scoop water switch. Eleanor used to say I made coffee like a man who did not particularly enjoy it. That was fair. I do not make it for the taste. I make it for something to do with my hands before the day has asked anything of me yet. The house on Perrysville Avenue is a red brick row house on the north side of Pittsburgh. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, a front porch with 2 steps, and a back door that has never in 60 years closed, completely flush against the frame. I moved into this house in 1962, the year before Kennedy was shot, the year my middle son David was born. I have replaced the water heater 4 times, repainted the kitchen twice, fixed that back door once. It still does not close right. When all 3 of my children were young, this house had a sound to it, from the moment someone woke up until the last light went off at night. Sneakers hitting the stairs, cereal bowls scraping, the television in the back room going before school. Eleanor in this kitchen making eggs that nobody stopped long enough to thank her for. The house used to feel too small. It used to feel crowded in the particular way that wears you down and keeps you going at the exact same time. Now it feels like what it is. A house with 1 person in it. I carried my coffee to the front room and settled into my chair, the brown armchair by the window, with the worn patch on the right armrest where my elbow has rested for the better part of 3 decades. It fits me the way a good work boot fits after enough years. Across from it, angled toward the bookshelf, sits Eleanor's chair, a high-backed reading chair, green fabric with a small floral pattern on the cushion that has faded some over the years. She picked it out herself sometime in the early 90s from a furniture store on the south side that closed down long before she did. I have not sat in Eleanor's chair since the day she passed. 6 years ago now. The chair is still there. I still dust it on Saturday mornings along with everything else in the room. I just do not sit in it. Some things you leave alone not because you have forgotten them, but because you have not forgotten them at all. I sat in my own chair and looked out at Perrysville Avenue. A neighbor I have never learned the name of walked a dog I had never seen before down the far side of the street. A delivery truck rolled through slowly and kept going. A few leaves pulled free from the oak tree in the front yard and came down easy, settling on the porch railing without any particular hurry. October in Pittsburgh, the city where I have spent every one of my 105 years, where my father worked the steel mills and my mother raised 4 children in a row house 3 blocks north of where I am sitting right now. I know this city the way you know your own face, not because you study it, but because it has simply always been there every time you looked. I looked down at my hands wrapped around the coffee mug. These are not pretty hands, and they never were. The knuckles are enlarged now, the skin loose and spotted over the bones. But the calluses are still there in the same places they have been since I was 30 years old. The base of the right palm, the inside of the left thumb. You do not earn those calluses from anything other than a life of real physical work, and once you have them, they do not entirely go away, not even after the work is long finished. These hands poured concrete and set foundation blocks in the Pittsburgh winters of the 1950s, when the wind off the Allegheny River came across an open job site like something with an intention to hurt you. They drove nails and carried lumber and climbed scaffolding on buildings in this city that are still standing today. Buildings I have driven past for 40 years without ever once saying a word about it to anyone riding with me. They signed school registration forms and mortgage documents, and eventually 3 separate checks for 3 separate college tuitions, each one a number I sat with for a moment before I put the pen down on it. On the morning of my 105th birthday, these same hands were holding a coffee mug in a quiet room, and there was nothing else for them to do. I sat there and listened to the house settle around me. The refrigerator ran its low hum in the kitchen. The radiator ticked twice. Somewhere inside the wall above the staircase, that pipe knocked once more, and then went silent, as if it had said what it needed to say, and was done with it. That was the whole sound of my birthday morning. A refrigerator, a radiator, a pipe in the wall. I did not turn the television on. I did not pick up my phone. I sat in the thin October light and drank my coffee while it was still warm, and then I kept sitting there after it went cold, and the clock above the kitchen doorway did what clocks do on every morning birthday. Or otherwise it moved forward unhurried, without any particular feeling about the occasion. I sat there until the clock read 10 past 10, and then my phone lit up on the side table next to my chair. I looked down at the screen. One notification. A name I have known longer than almost any other name in my life. It was Mike. Mike did not call. Mike sent a text message and a bank notification. 4 words and a number, "Happy birthday, Dad." Sent $200. I read it twice. Then a third time slower in case I had misread something the first 2 times. I had not. I set the phone back down on the side table and looked out the window at the street. Mike is my oldest. He will be 71 next March. He lives in Chicago now, has for the past 20 years run some kind of consulting firm I have never entirely understood the purpose of, even after he explained it to me more than once. He has a good life out there. A nice apartment from what I can tell in the photographs. He works hard. I know that much about him at least. What I did not know, sitting in my chair on Perrysville Avenue, on the morning of my 105th birthday was what $200 was supposed to mean. I thought about a check I wrote in the fall of 1978, Mike's first semester at the University of Pittsburgh. Tuition room board, the whole number came to just under $4,000, which in 1978 was not a small amount of money for a man who poured concrete for a living. I remember sitting at this same kitchen table with the checkbook open, writing that number out in longhand, the way you had to back then, and not hesitating for a second. Not because it was easy, because it was Mike. Because that was what you did. I did not need a thank you for that check. I never needed a thank you for any of it. That is not the point I am making. The point is that $200 sent from a phone in Chicago on a Tuesday morning felt less like a gift and more like a door being closed quietly from the other side by someone who hoped you would not notice the sound. I left the phone on the table and went to the kitchen to make myself a second cup of coffee I did not particularly want. By 6 o'clock that evening, the light outside had gone flat and gray, the way it does in Pittsburgh in October, when the sun drops behind the hills early and does not make a production of leaving. I was in the kitchen heating up some soup when the phone rang on the counter. The screen said, David. David is my middle boy. 63 years old. He lives over in Cleveland, about 2 hours up the highway. Works for the city in some administrative capacity. I could not tell you exactly what department if you pressed me on it, because every time I have asked, the answer involves a string of words that do not add up to a picture I can hold in my head. I put the phone on speaker the way I always do now. The volume on speakerphone combined with my hearing aids is the only way a phone conversation makes complete sense to me at this point. Everything comes through clearly that way. Which on that particular evening turned out to be something of a problem. Because I could hear David just fine, I could also hear his television. He had it on in the background, one of those evening shows with a studio audience, the kind where people laugh on cue. The laugh track came through the speaker on my end, clear as anything, every time David paused between sentences, like a third party on the line who found everything much funnier than I did. David asked how I was feeling. I told him fine. He asked if I had done anything special. I told him not particularly. He said that was too bad, and that he had been meaning to call earlier in the day, but things had gotten away from him. The studio audience laughed at something on his end. I told him it was all right. He said he had to get going. I said sure. He said he would talk to me soon. I said okay. 3 minutes. I know because I looked at the screen after he hung up. 3 minutes and 14 seconds to be exact. The soup was boiling over on the stove. 2 days later, a card arrived in the mail. The return address in the upper left corner said, Atlanta, Georgia, which is where my youngest Sarah has lived for the past 12 years. She is 59, my only daughter, the last of the 3 born in the summer of 1966, when Eleanor and I had just about decided we were finished having children, and then found out in the cheerful way life sometimes informs you of things that we were not. The envelope was a standard greeting card size cream, colored with my name and address, written in blue ink in Sarah's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. She has had the same handwriting since she was a teenager, a quick forward-leaning script, like each letter is in a slight hurry to get to the next one. I opened it at the kitchen table. The front of the card had a picture of a candle on it, which I suppose was meant to suggest a birthday cake without committing to one. Inside, the printed text said something about celebrating another year. Below it, in blue ink, 4 words in Sarah's forward-leaning hand. Love you, Dad. Sarah. That was all. I turned the card over and looked at the back. A manufacturer's logo. A barcode. A small notation about recycled materials. Nothing else. No extra line. No memory she wanted to share. No question about how I was doing. Just her name written in 4 seconds on a card that had taken 2 days to make the trip up from Atlanta. I set it on the kitchen table. Then I set my phone down next to it, open to Mike's text message, and I pulled out the small notepad I keep by the telephone, where I write down the length of calls, a habit I picked up from Eleanor years ago when we were trying to keep track of the long-distance bill. I wrote David 3 minutes, 14 seconds, October 14th. I looked at the 3 things on that kitchen table. The text message on the phone screen, the entry in the notepad, the card with its 4 words and its blank back. I sat there for a long time, not moving, while the afternoon light faded out of the kitchen window and the room went slowly dim around me. This was what 105 years of fatherhood had come down to. I wanted to look at it clearly without flinching before I decided what to do next. That evening, while what was left of my birthday faded into the dark, outside the kitchen window, I sat with my cold coffee and the 3 things on the table in front of me and looked at my hands. Not at the skin or the spots or the way the knuckles have thickened over the years into something that no longer looks entirely like the hands I was born with. I have made my peace with all of that. I looked at something else, at the particular geography of them, where the weight has settled, where the years went. Before I tell you what I decided that night, you need to know what these hands have done. Because a decision means nothing unless you understand the life that led up to it. I started in construction in 1947 when I was 27 years old, and the war had been over for 2 years, and Pittsburgh was rebuilding itself the way American cities did back then, loud and fast, and without a great deal of sentimentality about it. I hired on with a concrete crew working residential foundations on the north side. 6 days a week, weather permitting, and in Pittsburgh in the 1950s, weather rarely permitted anything without a fight. The winters on a job site in this city are something that does not translate well into words unless you have stood in one. The wind comes off the 3 rivers with a particular intention to it, and when you are working with wet concrete in 20-degree weather, your hands do not warm up during the day. They just get less cold for a few hours, and then go back to being cold again. You learn to work through it. You do not have a choice, and you do not spend much time thinking about whether you have a choice because the men working alongside you are doing the same thing, and nobody is complaining, and that is simply the culture of it. That is how men of my generation and my circumstances understood work. You showed up. You did the job. You went home. I moved off the concrete crew and into general commercial construction in the late 1950s, bigger projects, higher buildings, more hours. I worked on office buildings downtown that are still part of the Pittsburgh skyline today. I have never pointed them out to anyone. That is not something I know how to do without feeling like I am asking for something, and I have spent most of my life trying not to ask for things. When the 3 children were young, and Eleanor was managing the house on what I brought home, I took night shifts when the work was available. There was a period in the late 1960s when all 3 kids were in school, and the bills were arriving in a particular rhythm, where I worked days on a hospital expansion project in Oakland, and then spent 3 nights a week driving a delivery truck for a lumber yard out in Bethel Park. I would get home at 2 in the morning, sleep until 5:30, and be back on the hospital site by 6:45. I did that for 11 months. I do not tell you this because I want credit for it. I tell you because it is the truth of where the money came from and the truth of where these hands were during those years. Mike spent 3 years working at the steel plant in Hazelwood after he graduated high school in 1973. That was his choice, and I respected it. A lot of young men from Pittsburgh families like ours did the same thing in those years, and there was nothing wrong with it. The mills were still running, then still the backbone of what this city thought it was. By 1976, the writing was starting to appear on the wall for the steel industry, though not everyone was reading it yet. And Mike came to me that fall and said he wanted to go to college. He had picked out the University of Pittsburgh. He had looked into it himself. In the fall of 1978, I sat at this kitchen table and wrote a check for his first semester tuition room board. The full number came to just under $4,000. I wrote it in longhand the way you had to back then, and I did not hesitate for a second. Not because $4,000 was nothing to me in 1978. It was a great deal to me in 1978. But it was Mike. And then it was David 4 years later. And then Sarah after that. 3 checks years apart, each one a number I sat with for a breath before I put the pen to it. Not because I begrudged it, because I wanted to feel the weight of it. I wanted to know what it cost so that I would never forget what it was for. I have never once regretted any of those checks. In the spring of 1958, before any of that, before the college tuitions, before the night shifts, before the hospital project in Oakland, I sat in this same kitchen on a Saturday afternoon with a cup of coffee and a hardware store receipt that I had emptied my pockets onto the table and found. I turned it over to the blank side. I picked up a pen. I wrote a short list. Go fishing on the Allegheny River. Write something down, something real before I die. See a game at Forbes Field. That last one became impossible 11 years later, when they tore Forbes Field down to build a university building, which is exactly the sort of thing life does to you when you are not paying attention. But the other 2 stayed on the list. I folded the receipt twice the way you fold something small that you mean to come back to, and tucked it into the back pages of a book I had been reading at the kitchen table for 3 weeks without making much progress. East of Eden, John Steinbeck. The bookmark was on page 63. I thought I would finish it that summer. I did not finish it that summer. I did not finish it any summer after that either. But the folded receipt stayed in the back pages, and the book stayed on the shelf in the front room, and the bookmark stayed on page 63. And eventually, I stopped noticing any of it. Mike graduated from Pitt in the spring of 1982. I drove up to the campus for the ceremony, Eleanor beside me in the car, and I stood in the crowd in the sun and watched my oldest son walk across a stage and accept a diploma, which was something no one in my family had ever done before him. I want to be clear about what that moment meant to me. I want to be precise about it because precision matters here. It meant everything. Afterward, in the courtyard with the crowd moving all around us, Mike came over and shook my hand. Not the way a son shakes his father's hand after something like that. The way you shake the hand of someone you have just been introduced to at a business function firm, brief over in a second, eyes already moving to the next thing. I told myself it was just the crowd, that he was overwhelmed, that we were not a demonstrative family, and this was what that looked like in practice. I told myself that for 20 years. Now, sitting at the kitchen table on the night of my 105th birthday, with a cold cup of coffee and 3 small pieces of evidence arranged in front of me, I wondered when exactly I had stopped believing it and just kept saying it out of habit. I looked up at the front room at the bookshelf just visible through the doorway. I thought about all of that. The concrete crews, the night shifts, the checks, the handshake in the courtyard. And then I thought about something else entirely. Something I had not thought about in a very long time. The book on the shelf, and what was still folded inside the back pages. I am still at that kitchen table. Still that same night. The book on the shelf in the next room is not going anywhere, and I will get to it. But before I tell you the decision I made, you need to understand what I had been doing for years leading up to it. You need to understand the waiting. Because the waiting is a thing that happens slowly and then all at once. And by the time you notice it, you have already been inside it for longer than you know. Here is what my evenings looked like for the better part of the last decade. I would heat something up for dinner, soup from a can or a piece of chicken I had cooked on Sunday and portioned out across the week. Nothing complicated. I stopped cooking complicated things sometime around 2017 when it became clear that cooking for one person requires a particular kind of motivation I was finding harder to locate. I would eat at the kitchen table, which is where I eat every meal, have for 60 years. And I would put the phone on the table next to the plate, just in case. Not face down, the way you put a phone when you want to ignore it. Face up, screen, visible, volume on. Just in case one of them called during dinner. Just in case this was the evening one of them thought to check in, without being prompted, without a holiday or a birthday to provide the occasion. Just because. I would eat my dinner looking at that phone the way you look at a door you are waiting for someone to walk through. After dinner, I would move to the front room and sit in my chair. The phone came with me. I would turn on the evening news out of habit, though I stopped following it as closely as I used to, and I would sit there with the phone on the armrest and check the screen every so often. Not constantly, every so often. The way you check the sky when you are hoping for rain and trying not to hope too hard. Sometimes I fell asleep in the chair. When I woke up, the phone would be in my lap, and I would check it before I was fully conscious of where I was. Nothing. I would get myself to bed. And in the morning, this is the part I am not proud of. But I am going to tell you anyway, because you need the whole picture in the morning. Before my feet hit the floor, before I put my hearing aids in, before I had any particular sense of what day it was, I would reach for the phone on the nightstand and check it. Nothing. I did that for years. There were the voicemails. If I had not heard from one of them in a while, and a while, I am embarrassed to say, could mean as little as 10 days, 12 days, 2 weeks, I would call. I would get the voicemail, which happens more often than not with people who are busy and have learned that a call from a parent can be returned at their convenience. The voicemail message would come on, and I would listen to it, the recorded version of my child's voice saying they could not come to the phone right now. And then I would hear the beep, and then I would say, "Hey, it's Dad. Just checking in on you. Call me back when you get a chance." That is the whole message. 9 words after the greeting. I said some version of it dozens of times across the years. "Hey, it's Dad. Just checking in. Call me back." And then I would wait. I would wait through the rest of that afternoon, and through dinner, and through the evening news, and through whatever movie I put on at 8 o'clock that I was not really watching. I would fall asleep waiting. And first thing in the morning before my feet hit the floor, I would check. Sometimes they called back the next day. Sometimes it was 3 days later. Sometimes I had already left a second message before the first one got a response, and there is no dignity in that, in being 70 years old, 80 years old, 100 years old, and leaving a second voicemail because the first one did not take. I am telling you all of this because I think you know it. Not as a story you have heard, as a thing you have lived. I think some of you are sitting with this right now, in a way that has nothing to do with me, and everything to do with your own kitchen table, your own phone face up by the plate, your own 9 words going into a voicemail that gets returned 3 days later, if at all. You know this feeling. You have sat in that chair. Maybe you are sitting in it right now, listening to an old man tell you things you already know, hoping that the knowing of it is enough to make it hurt a little less. I understand that hope. I held it myself for a long time. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from waiting for your own children. It is different from other kinds of loneliness, and I want to be accurate about why. It is not simply that the phone does not ring. It is what the silence means or what you tell yourself it means. In the hours after you check it and find nothing, you go through a list. You wonder if you said something wrong the last time you spoke. You wonder if you did something years ago that you have never been forgiven for and were never told about. You wonder if maybe you are the problem, if the distance is a verdict that has been handed down quietly without a hearing, and you missed the trial. You build the whole case against yourself in the time it takes the evening news to go from the top story to the weather. I did that for years. That night, the night I turned 105, I sat at the kitchen table after I had been through all of it in my head for the 100th time. and I picked up the phone. My right thumb found Mike's name in the contacts list, the way it always did, the way a hand finds a familiar tool in the dark. I have called that number so many times I could do it with my eyes shut. The screen was lit up, his name sitting there, and my thumb was resting right on it. And then I stopped, not because I talked myself out of it, not because I made some considered decision about the wisdom of calling at that hour. Something shifted in my chest, quiet and certain the way something settles when it has finally found the position it was always meant to be in. And I put the phone face down on the table. For the first time in years, I put it face down. I want to tell you exactly what that felt like. Because it was not strength. I need to be clear about that because I think there is a version of this story where a man puts a phone down and it looks like resolve, like he has made a firm decision, stood up straight, turned a corner. That is not what happened at that kitchen table on the night of my 105th birthday. What happened was quieter than that, and smaller, and more tired. It felt like something old finally letting go of a grip it had held for so long that neither of us had noticed it anymore. I sat there with the screen lit up and Mike's name on it, and I thought about the last 3 or 4 times I had called him and gotten through. Not the voicemails, the times he actually answered. What I remembered sitting there was not what we talked about. I could not have told you that if you pressed me. What I remembered was a particular tone in his voice, the one that appeared within the first 30 seconds of almost every call, and that I had learned to recognize the way you learn to read weather. A kind of patient, almost careful quality. Like a man who is giving something his attention even though his attention is needed somewhere else, and he is hoping you will not take too long. There was a phrase he used sometimes when I called at a moment that did not work for him. Not mean about it. Not unkind. Just factual. Not a great time, Dad. Can I call you back? And I would say, of course, absolutely, whenever you get a chance. And sometimes he did. And sometimes a week went by. I sat at the kitchen table and thought about how many times I had heard that phrase across the years and told myself it was just circumstance. He was busy. His work was demanding. The time zones were different. All of that was true. None of it was the whole story. Here is something I understood for the first time, sitting at that table with the phone face down in front of me. Every time I called after being ignored, every time I left a second voicemail after the first one went unanswered, every time I said, of course, whenever you get a chance, and then waited and said nothing when the chance never came. I was not closing the distance between us. I was not pulling them closer. I was teaching them something. I was teaching all 3 of them quietly and consistently over many years that I could be set aside, that I would accept whatever was offered and ask no questions about what was withheld, that my presence in their lives was something they could manage on their own schedule at their own convenience without consequence. I taught them that. I did not mean to. But intention does not change the lesson. You already know this. I can say that because I think everyone who has sat in the chair I am describing tonight has felt it at some level, even if the feeling never quite made it into words. You know the arithmetic of it. You know what it means when you are always the one who calls first, always the one who leaves the message, always the one who says, I understand, when you do not understand, not entirely. You know what it means. You have just been too generous with your own children to say it plainly. So let me say it plainly, because I am 105 years old, and I no longer have the patience for the version of the truth that is easier to hear. If you have to remind your own children that you are still here, they have already made a decision about how much of their life you are going to occupy. And every time you call again, every time you leave another message into the silence, you are not changing that decision. You are confirming it. I got up from the kitchen table slowly the way I do everything now. I pushed the chair back, put my hand on the table edge until I was steady on my feet, and I walked through the doorway into the front room. The lamp by the window was off. The only light came from the street light outside, filtering through the curtain, which gave the room a gray, underwater quality. I could make out the shapes of things: the bookshelf, the television, the two chairs across from each other by the window. I walked to Eleanor's chair and stood behind it. I put both hands on the back of it, on the top rail, and I stood there for a moment. The fabric was cool under my palms. I had dusted this chair 100 times in 6 years without ever sitting in it, and I was aware, standing there, that some part of me had been protecting something by not sitting in it. Some idea about what it meant to leave her things where she had left them, as if her absence was less complete, while the chair was still hers. I thought about that for a moment. Then I came around the side of it, lowered myself into the seat, the way I lower myself into any chair now. Carefully, one hand on the armrest, my weight going down in stages, and I sat. The cushion gave the way it always did, shaped to someone else after years of use, and I sat in it in the dark and looked at my own chair across from it. And for the first time in 6 years, I saw what Eleanor saw from this side of the room. It looked smaller from over here. My chair. The worn patch on the right armrest where my elbow had rested for 30 years. It looked like a place where someone had spent a great deal of time waiting. I turned that over in my head for a while in the quiet. And then I said something out loud to no one, to the empty room, to Eleanor, if she could hear it from wherever she was. If a man has to remind his own children that he is still alive, that is not family. That is obligation. And I did not spend 105 years on this earth to be somebody's obligation. I sat in Eleanor's chair, and I thought. Somewhere between midnight and 4 in the morning, sitting in Eleanor's chair for the first time in 6 years, I asked myself the question I had been walking around for a very long time. Not the question of whether my children cared about me. I knew the answer to that, or at least I knew the shape of it, complicated in the way that most true things are complicated, not the simple picture you can describe to someone in a sentence. The question I had been avoiding was different. When exactly had we become strangers? Not enemies. Not estranged in the dramatic sense that word gets used where there has been a rupture, a confrontation, a line drawn in the carpet somewhere. None of that had ever happened with Mike or David or Sarah. There was no single bad day I could point to. There was just distance. Accumulated slowly, the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river. You do not notice it building. You just notice one day that the water is shallower than it used to be. I looked at the photograph on the wall to the left of the bookshelf. It has been there since 1988, give or take a year. A family photograph, the kind you have taken professionally once a decade, if you are the kind of family that does that, which Eleanor always was, and I went along with, because Eleanor was usually right about things like that. The 4 of us in the front room of this house. Mike must have been 32 or 33. David in his late 20s. Sarah just past 20 still, with that look she had then, like she was somewhere between amused and impatient with the whole business of being photographed. Eleanor is in a navy blue dress with a white collar. I cannot tell you what the occasion was. I cannot tell you what month it was taken, or who was visiting from out of town, or what we had for dinner that evening. But I can tell you the exact color of Eleanor's dress, and the way she is smiling, not at the camera, but at something slightly to the left of it, like she has just thought of something private and is deciding whether to share it. I looked at that photograph for a long time in the dark. Here is the thing I had never said out loud. The thing I am going to say now because I think it matters and because I have run out of reasons to protect myself from it. For 20 years, whenever one of the children offered to come to Pittsburgh, for no particular reason, not a holiday, not a birthday, just to visit, I told them not to. I was careful about it. I was not cold. I would say something like, "No, don't make the trip, there's no need. I'm perfectly fine, save your money for something better." I said it with enough warmth that it sounded like consideration for their schedules and finances, which it was partly. But only partly. The other part was this: I had spent 100 years being the kind of man who did not need things from people, who managed, who was fine. Not performing it, actually believing it, or believing it enough. And somewhere in that belief was a wall I had built, without naming it, one brick at a time, over many decades, each brick a small refusal of help, each one an assurance to my children that I did not require their presence to be all right. And they believed me. Of course they did. I was convincing. I had been convincing for 100 years on this particular subject. So they stopped offering. Not because they did not love me. Because I had told them clearly and consistently that coming was not necessary. And people, even your own children, will eventually take you at your word. They will build their lives around the shape of the need you present to them. If you present no need, they fill that space with the rest of their lives, and the filling happens gradually and naturally and without any malice at all. I built that wall myself, one I'm fine at a time. I want to be precise here because precision matters, and I have already said that this does not make a $200 bank transfer an appropriate way to mark a 105th birthday. It does not make a 3-minute phone call with a television going in the background an act of love. Those things are what they are. But a wall has two sides, and both sides of this particular wall had my handprints on them. I had not admitted that before that night. Not fully. I had circled around it the way you circle a thing you are not ready to look at directly. Sitting in Eleanor's chair in the dark on the night of my birthday, I looked at it directly. Eleanor said something to me once years ago, that I had filed away the way you file away the things your wife says that you suspect are important, but cannot quite process at the time. We had been talking about a neighbor of ours, a woman down the street, whose adult son rarely visited, and who had taken to dropping it into conversation in a way that was becoming increasingly painful to be around. Eleanor and I were in this kitchen, I think, having coffee after dinner. And she said, "Walter, you cannot chase someone into loving you. You can only make yourself worth coming back to." I thought she was talking about the neighbor's son. I thought about that for a moment, sitting in her chair in the dark. She was not talking about the neighbor's son. She was talking about me and about what was coming, and about the kind of man she had spent 62 years watching prepare himself for the wrong solution to the right problem. Eleanor was often about 30 seconds ahead of the rest of us. That was just how she was built. I sat there until the quality of the dark began to change. Until the streetlight outside stopped being the brightest thing and something gray and pale started to show through the gap in the curtain, the particular gray that means Pittsburgh is about to remember that it is morning. I had been sitting in that chair for somewhere between 3 and 4 hours. My back was telling me about it in the way that backs do at my age, and I did not particularly care. When the first thin light came through the curtain on Perrysville Avenue, I made up my mind. I was going to put on my good suit, and I was going to walk next door and knock. The morning after my 105th birthday, I took my good suit out of the closet for the first time in 2 years. It was the dark charcoal one Eleanor had picked out for me sometime in the early 2000s, for a funeral I cannot now remember whose it was. She had good taste about those things. Eleanor always knew what a man should wear for occasions that required him to look like he was taking them seriously. I had worn this suit to her own funeral 6 years ago, and then hung it back in the closet, and not touched it since. I took it down from the hanger and laid it on the bed and looked at it for a moment. The collar had a slight fold to it from the years of hanging. I do not own an iron, or rather I own one, but I could not tell you where it is. I smoothed the collar with my hands, pressing the fabric flat with my palms, the way you would with a letter before you put it in an envelope. It was not perfect. It was good enough. I dressed carefully. At my age, dressing carefully is not vanity. It is just the pace at which things get done when your fingers have some mornings and not others. I tied the tie twice before I was satisfied with it. I found the good shoes in the back of the closet, the black leather ones, and I sat on the edge of the bed to put them on, which is the only sensible way to put shoes on when you are 105 years old and the floor is farther away than it used to be. Then I went downstairs. The front porch has 2 steps down to the sidewalk, and there is a railing on the right side that I had Earl Dunning, a man from the neighborhood, who does that sort of thing, install for me 3 years ago when the steps started requiring more thought than they used to. I took hold of it going down, same as always. I do not make a point of noting it anymore. It is just how the steps work now. It was a cold morning. The sky over Perrysville Avenue was a pale gray going blue at the edges, the kind of sky Pittsburgh does in October that is not quite deciding whether to be beautiful or miserable. The oak tree in my front yard had shed most of its leaves overnight, and they were piled against the porch railing and scattered across the sidewalk in the particular careless way that leaves have of going everywhere without going anywhere. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the air, which was sharp and clean and smelled of fall in the specific way that Pittsburgh falls do something in it that is half wood smoke and half the river, even here on the north side, where you cannot see the water. Then I turned and walked next door. Harper Connolly has lived in the house to the right of mine for 7 years. She is 85 years old, which sounds like a great age until you spend 5 minutes around her, after which it becomes simply a number with very little bearing on the situation. She keeps a garden in the small plot of ground between her front porch and the sidewalk that is somehow still producing something green even in October, which I have always taken as a personal comment on my own front yard. She drives herself wherever she needs to go. She has opinions about things and is not shy about them. In 7 years of living next door to each other, we had exchanged probably 200 short conversations over the fence or in passing on the sidewalk. She knew my name. I knew hers. I could not have told you much beyond that. I walked up her front steps. She does not have a railing, which I noticed in the way you notice things differently depending on where you are in life, and I stood in front of her door. And then I stood there for another 3 minutes without knocking. I am not sure I can explain that 3 minutes fully. It was not indecision I had decided in Eleanor's chair at 4 in the morning, and I do not unmake decisions once they are made. It was something more like the gap between knowing you are going to do something and actually doing it when the thing in question is something you have not done in so long that the doing of it requires your body to remember that it knows how. I had not asked anyone for anything in a very long time. I raised my hand and knocked. The door opened within 15 seconds. Harper Connolly stood in the doorway in a blue cardigan and with a cup of coffee in her hand, and she looked at me at the charcoal suit at the tied tie at the man standing on her front steps at 7:40 in the morning, and she did not say a word for a moment. She did not look surprised. That is the thing I want to be accurate about, because it mattered to me in a way I could not have articulated at the time. She looked at me with an expression that I could only describe as recognition, as though she had been expecting someone to stand on her porch in a suit at some point, and had simply been waiting for the morning it turned out to be true. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. And she stepped back inside. I waited on the porch. 3 minutes later, she came back out with her coat and her keys and another cup of coffee that she handed to me without asking whether I wanted it. Harper drives a silver Buick that is 7 years old and extremely clean. She keeps a folder of maps in the passenger door pocket, even though she has never, to my knowledge, gotten lost anywhere in Pittsburgh in her life. She drives the way she does everything else with a directness that does not waste time looking for trouble, but is not surprised to find it. I sat in the passenger seat, and she pulled away from the curb on Perrysville, and I looked out the window at the street I have lived on for 60 years going past me from a different angle. I had not been in a car with another person for 8 months. I had not fully registered that fact until I was sitting in it. There is a particular quality to the presence of another human being in a confined space that you stop noticing when you are always alone, the sound of someone else breathing, the small adjustments they make in the seat, the fact of them. I sat there and felt it, the way you feel something you did not know had been missing. We did not talk much on the drive. Harper asked how I had slept. I told her not well. She nodded like that was a reasonable answer to a reasonable question and left it there. She turned onto Penn Avenue and drove a few blocks east and pulled into a parking space on the right side of the street. She pointed at a sign above a diner door across the sidewalk. Vet's Corner. Through the plate glass window I could see people inside. Old people, most of them. Sitting around tables, eating, talking with the easy and unhurried quality of people who have nowhere else they need to be. A man at a table near the window said something and threw his head back with a laugh that I could not hear through the glass but could feel anyway. Not one of them was looking at a phone. The moment I walked through that door, 12 heads turned, and not one of them looked away to check a screen. They just looked at me the way people used to look at each other before everyone had somewhere else to be at all times. Straight and unhurried, with a kind of attention that felt different from what I had gotten used to, which was mostly the top of people's heads as they looked down at something in their hands. Harper held the door for me from behind as I stepped in. I did not protest. There is an age at which protesting a held door stops being about dignity and starts being about ego, and I crossed that age some time ago. The diner was long and narrow, the way old Penn Avenue storefronts tend to be built, in an era when buildings were pressed together tight and went deep instead of wide. A counter ran along the left side with 8 stools, half of them occupied. The right side had booths and tables, mismatched chairs, the accumulated furniture of a place that has been open long enough to stop worrying about what matches what. The walls were covered with photographs, most of them in black and white, most of them showing men in uniform from various decades, and a few framed citations and unit patches that I could not read from the door. The smell was coffee and something with butter in it, and the particular warmth of a room where many people have eaten many meals over many years, which is a specific kind of warmth that has nothing to do with the temperature. Harper guided me toward a large round table near the back, where most of the 12 people were gathered. The rest were at nearby tables that had drifted into the orbit of this one the way tables do when the people sitting at them have been coming to the same place every week for long enough that the geography has sorted itself out organically. She introduced me around the table, and I am going to tell you about the ones I remember most clearly from that first morning, because there were several of them, and I do not want to give you a blur when what I mean to give you is a picture. Gene Kowalski was sitting at the near end, a coffee cup in both hands, not talking to anyone. He is 82 years old, a compact, square-shouldered man who spent 2 years in Vietnam in the late 1960s and has the quality that some men carry back from that kind of experience, a stillness that is not unfriendly, but is very clearly its own. He looked at me when Harper said my name and nodded once, which I took as all the greeting that was on offer and found it sufficient. Ruth Caldwell was at the center of the table, and it quickly became apparent the center of most conversations within a 10-foot radius. 78 years old, retired after 31 years teaching 3rd grade at a public elementary school in Brookline. She laughs easily and completely, the kind of laugh that involves her whole face and does not leave room for anything self-conscious. Within 4 minutes of my sitting down, she had told me the names of 3 of her former students who had gone on to play college baseball and one who had become a county judge, and she produced this information with the satisfaction of someone who has been keeping careful track and considers the tracking to be part of the job. Franklin Dodd was at the far end of the table and was the source of the laugh I had seen through the plate glass window on Penn Avenue. He is 83 years old and spent 30 years with the Pittsburgh Bureau of Fire before he retired, and he has the laugh of a man who decided at some point that if something is funny, it is worth committing to fully. When Franklin laughs, the people at the nearest booth look over, not because it is disruptive, but because it is the kind of sound that makes you want to know what the joke was. Otis Brewer was sitting slightly back from the table at an angle as though he had pulled his chair out a few inches to give himself a little more air. He is 79, and before he retired, he played jazz piano at clubs around Pittsburgh and taught music privately from a studio in his house in Polish Hill. He had a harmonica in the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. I noticed it because he touched it once, absently, the way some people touch a watch or a ring, not to use it, just to confirm it is still there. The others at the table, Mabel Thornton, who keeps a garden on her back porch and brought a tin of something baked that morning. Earl Dunning, who was a mechanic for 40 years and still fixes things for people in the neighborhood on a handshake arrangement. Vivian Cross, a retired nurse who has a habit of looking at you briefly but carefully when you sit down the way nurses do. Lorraine Hayes, who quotes books with great confidence and occasional inaccuracy. Dolores Webb, who made the best BBQ on the North Side according to Franklin, who said so twice. And Clarence Pitts, who turned out to have worked construction in Pittsburgh in the 1970s, and looked at my hands when Harper said what I had done for a living. The others filled the rest of the table with the comfortable noise of people who have already said the necessary things to each other, and are now well past the point of needing to prove anything. Gene pushed a coffee cup across the table toward me without preamble. Not his own, a clean one from the stack near the center filled from the carafe. He did it the way you do something for someone when you have decided they belong there, and the paperwork is just a formality. He looked at me. "You serve." I said no. I said construction. He nodded. Same thing he said. That was the whole exchange. I understood from it that I was in the right place. I sat at that table for 2 hours and 17 minutes. I know this because I looked at my watch 4 separate times during those 2 hours, not to see if I needed to leave, but to see if I wanted to. If the feeling that I had overstayed had arrived yet. If the particular restlessness that comes from being somewhere unfamiliar with people you do not know had come to collect me. It did not come. Ruth told a story about a former student that involved a county fair, a misunderstanding about livestock regulations, and a school principal who had since moved to Arizona. And I laughed at the part where I was supposed to laugh. Franklin said something in response that made the nearby booth look over again. Otis touched the harmonica in his pocket and smiled at something nobody else had said out loud. I drank 3 cups of coffee and ate a piece of whatever Mabel had brought in the tin, which turned out to be a kind of spiced shortbread that she made from her mother's recipe, and which was very good. At one point, Ruth asked me how long I had lived on the North Side, and I told her 60 years, and she said that practically made me a native, and several people at the table agreed with more conviction than I expected. And I understood from this that 60 years in one neighborhood in Pittsburgh carries a kind of weight that people here take seriously, which it should, because it is a serious thing. When Harper brought the car around to Penn Avenue at the end of the morning, she held the diner door for me going out the same way she had held it going in, and we drove back to Perrysville Avenue mostly quiet. In front of my house with the engine idling, she looked over at me. Same time next week. I went back the next Tuesday. I wore the same suit. I sat in the same chair at the round table near the back. The coffee was the same temperature it had been the week before, which is to say not quite hot, not quite warm, somewhere in between, in the way of diner coffee that has been sitting in a carafe for 45 minutes and is not apologizing for it. By the 3rd week, I stopped wearing the suit. I came in a good sweater and a collared shirt, which felt like a promotion of a different kind, the kind where the ceremony is over and the actual work begins. Nobody commented on the change. That told me everything I needed to know about the kind of place this was. Somewhere around the 3rd or 4th Tuesday, without deciding to, I started talking. Not about anything important at first. I told a story about a staircase I had built wrong in the fall of 1962, a set of interior stairs in a row house in Allegheny West for a family whose name I could no longer remember. I had miscalculated the rise-to-run ratio by a fraction of an inch across 12 steps, which does not sound like much until you have climbed that staircase and your body tells you something is wrong without being able to say what. The family noticed after 2 weeks. I came back on a Saturday morning, tore the whole thing out, and rebuilt it over 2 days on my own time, without charging for the labor. I had never told anyone that story, because it was not the kind of story you tell when you are trying to make a good impression. At Vet's Corner, it turned out to be the kind of story people wanted to hear. Franklin Dodd said he had responded to a fire call once, where the staircase had been so badly constructed that it collapsed under 2 of his crew, and the architect who had signed off on the plans had since moved to a state he named with a satisfaction that suggested it was a place people went when they were running from something. Ruth Caldwell said the elementary school where she had taught for 31 years had a fire exit door that opened inward, which anyone could tell you was wrong, and it had taken the district 11 years and 3 fire inspections to correct it. Otis Brewer said nothing touched the harmonica in his pocket and smiled the way he did when something amused him without surprising him. I had not told a story to a room full of people in a very long time. I had forgotten what it felt like when the room was listening. 3 weeks into the Tuesdays, on a morning when the October cold had come in properly, and the windows of the diner were fogged at the edges, a man came in that I recognized before I could place him. He was 81 years old, not tall, with the build of a man who had spent a working life doing things with his body that required it to be solid and reliable, rather than impressive. He came to the table, and Harper introduced him as Clarence Pitts. She said he had worked construction in Pittsburgh for most of his career. He put his hand out and I shook it. That was when I placed him. Not the face had changed the way all faces change across 30 years. It was the handshake. There are men who have worked with their hands their whole lives, and the handshake carries that history in a way that is distinct and unmistakable once you know what you are feeling for. It is not about strength. It is about the quality of the grip where the callus falls, how the fingers close the weight and timing of it. I said Kowalski's crew, 1970-something. He said 73, strip district job. You built the fire escape backwards. I had built the fire escape backwards. I had also caught the error myself before the inspector arrived, and corrected it in one afternoon, which I told him, and he laughed the way you laugh at a thing that has been a private joke for 30 years, and has finally found a second person to share it with. We had not seen each other in close to 3 decades. We did not ask why. When you reach a certain age, the gaps between things stop requiring explanation. People lose touch. Life moves in different directions. What matters is the morning you end up at the same table in a diner on Penn Avenue, and the handshake tells you everything that needs to be said. The Wednesdays were Harper's idea. The week after my 3rd Tuesday at Vet's Corner, she called and asked if I had ever been to Shenley Park in October. I said I had been there plenty of times over the years, but not recently. She said she drove through it sometimes on Wednesday mornings and asked if I wanted company. She drove us down through Oakland, which is where the University of Pittsburgh is, and where Carnegie Mellon sits up on the hill, and where the streets narrow and the buildings get older and more serious-looking in the way of neighborhoods that have been doing the same things for a long time. Shenley Park is at the edge of all of that 400 and some acres of hill and tree and path that Pittsburgh, for some reason I have always been grateful for, decided to keep as a park instead of building on. We did not walk the hills. Harper knew better than to suggest it, and I knew better than to pretend I wanted to. We parked near the main entrance on Shenley Drive and walked a short, flat stretch to a bench under a line of oak trees that had gone almost fully gold by mid-October. We sat there for an hour. I watched the leaves come down. Not all at once the way they come down in Pittsburgh in October is one at a time or 2 or 3 together, unhurried, taking the long way to the ground. The light through the remaining leaves had that particular quality of late-season light that is softer and more sideways than summer light, and it fell on everything gently and without urgency. I had looked at October leaves many times in my life. On this bench, for the first time in longer than I could account for, I looked at them without feeling anything underneath the looking. No awareness of the empty house. No counting of the days since someone had called. Just the leaves and the light and the cold air and Clarence's fire escape joke still sitting somewhere in my chest in a pleasant way. On the drive back to the north side, I reached into my jacket pocket for something and found my phone. I could not remember the last time I had looked at it. I checked the time on it the way you check the time on a clock, not hoping for anything, just checking the time. There was nothing on the screen except the time. For the first occasion I could remember in years, that was all it needed to be. A few Wednesdays later, walking back along the flat path to the parking area, Harper asked me a question. Had I ever gone fishing on the Allegheny River? I told her I had always meant to. That it had been on a list I made once a long time ago. I did not explain further about the list. It felt like too much to get into on a path in a park. She went quiet for a few steps. Then she said, I know. Just those 2 words. Not I figured, or I thought so. Or that sounds like something you would want. Just I know. Said in the particular way of someone who is not guessing. I did not ask how she knew. Something in the way she said it, level, unhurried, like a person who has been carrying a piece of information for a while and has finally found the right moment to set it down, partway, told me not to ask yet. We got back to the car. She drove. I looked out the window at the park going past. Still with me, drop 105 in the comments. Just that number. Because what comes next happened alone on a cold floor at 2 in the morning. And it is the part I almost kept to myself. Note some details ahead are shaped for storytelling. If that is not for you, this is a good place to pause. Everyone else, I will see your 105. The following Wednesday, Harper picked me up at 6 in the morning with 2 fishing rods in the back seat and bad coffee in a thermos. I want to say something about the coffee before I say anything else because it is relevant. Harper makes coffee the way a person makes coffee when they are thinking about everything except the coffee. It comes out a color that is optimistic, but a temperature that is not, and it has the particular quality of diner coffee that has been wrong for so long it has become its own thing entirely. I have drunk 4 or 5 thermoses of it by now, and I would not change it. She drove us down through the Strip District, which is a neighborhood along the river where Pittsburgh keeps its wholesale produce markets and its restaurants and its sense of itself as a working city even now. At the waterfront, she pulled into a flat concrete area near a section of the Riverwalk that was empty at that hour with only a few fishermen set up farther down the bank, small and still in the morning gray. Before I had finished getting out of the car, Harper had already pulled a folding chair from her trunk, one of the kind with a solid back and armrests the sort designed for people who need their chair to be doing some of the work, and set it up on the flat concrete section above the bank. Not on the grass, not on the gravel, but on the flat concrete where the footing was certain. She did not say anything about it. She just set it up and went back to the car for the rods. I sat down in the chair without commenting. We had reached by then a comfortable understanding about certain things. The Allegheny River in the early morning in late October is a particular kind of quiet. Not silent, the city is never fully silent, and the river least of all. There are barges that move through at all hours, and the sound of the water against the bank and the particular acoustic quality of a wide river between 2 hills that channels sound in ways you do not expect. But at 6 in the morning, with the mist still on the surface and the light coming up gray and slow behind the hills to the east, there is a quality to all of it that is close enough to silence that the distinction stops mattering. We set our lines out and sat. 3 hours passed. I know because I checked my watch once when the sun had come fully up above the tree line and the mist was mostly gone, and I was surprised to find it was already past 8:30. The time had gone without my noticing it go, which is a thing that used to happen to me regularly when I was young, and working time disappearing into the physical business of doing something, and which had largely stopped happening in the years since I retired. I did not take my phone out of my jacket pocket once during those 3 hours. This was not a decision I made. The phone was simply there, and my hands were doing other things, and the thought of looking at it did not arrive. The water was low for the season, the color of old pewter in the morning light. A great blue heron stood on a concrete piling about 40 feet upstream, motionless in the way herons are motionless, not resting, but attending. We caught nothing significant. That was not the point, and I had stopped pretending it was somewhere around the second hour. At some point, without preamble or particular significance in her voice, Harper asked about my children, not how they were doing, not whether I had heard from them. She asked what they were like, which is a different question, and I sat with the difference for a moment before I answered it. I told her that Mike was meticulous and ambitious in the way of men who grew up watching their fathers work very hard for things that were still not quite enough, and had drawn from that a determination to make sure the same could not be said of them. I told her David was quieter, more private, the kind of man who keeps his inner weather to himself, which I had always respected, even when it made him difficult to reach. I told her Sarah was the sharpest of the three, could see through things faster than any of them, and had a way of saying true things in a tone that made you feel it was your idea to agree with her. Harper listened to all of this without saying much. When I was done, she asked if I missed them. I told her that was a more complicated question than it sounded. She said she imagined it was, and handed me a different hook for my line, because the first one had lost its edge. We sat quietly for a while after that, and the heron upstream had not moved, and I found myself saying something that I had not planned to say. I told her about last March. I had gotten up in the night to use the bathroom the way you do at 105 years old, more often than you would like. It was around 2 in the morning. The tile floor was cold. I keep a bath mat, but it had gotten pushed to one side earlier in the day, and I had not straightened it before bed. My right foot came down on the tile without the mat under it, and the tile was cold and smooth, and I went down. Not all at once. There was a moment where I knew it was happening, and could not do anything about it. And then I was on the floor with my shoulder against the base of the tub, and the cold of the tile coming up through my pajama shirt immediately. The way cold does when there is nothing between you and a hard surface. I was not hurt seriously. Shaken and bruised along the left side where I had tried to catch myself on the way down, but nothing broken. I know what broken feels like. I have broken things before. Over 105 years you break things, and this was not that. But I was on the floor, and my phone was on the nightstand in the bedroom, and I was not sure I could stand up unassisted, and I lay there on the cold tile for somewhere around 15 minutes, working through it methodically. I eventually got myself to sitting by using the tub edge, and from sitting to standing took another few minutes, and when I was on my feet, I stood still in the doorway for a while, until I was satisfied everything was where it was supposed to be. Then I went back to bed. I did not call anyone. It was 2 in the morning, and I did not want to alarm anyone, and I was all right. That is what I told myself. But here is what I did not tell myself that night, and what I was telling Harper on the bank of the Allegheny River on a Wednesday morning in November, in the 15 minutes I spent on that cold tile floor. The name that came to me, the name that my mind went to when it was trying to find someone to call, was not Mike. It was not David. It was not Sarah. It was Harper, my neighbor. A woman I had exchanged 200 sidewalk conversations with in 7 years. A woman whose last name I had looked up on the mailbox the day I decided to knock on her door. That was the name my mind produced when it was not thinking carefully about what it was supposed to say. I told Harper all of this on the riverbank looking out at the water, and when I was done, I did not look at her right away. I watched the heron on the piling instead. It had not moved. When I did look over, Harper was reaching into the tackle box for a replacement hook for my line. She found one and held it out. I took it. Her hands were not steady, not obviously. Not in a way that anyone watching from a distance would have noticed. But I was sitting right beside her, and I noticed the particular quality of the tremor, not the small normal tremor of age which I know well because I have it myself, but something different. Something in the hands of a person managing a feeling that the hands are having trouble keeping to themselves. I told myself it was the cold air coming off the water. I almost believed it. On the Thursday after our first morning on the river, I came home from Vet's Corner in the afternoon and stood in the kitchen for a while without doing anything in particular. This is something I have always done, stood still in a room when something is working its way toward a decision without my conscious help. Eleanor used to come in and find me standing in the kitchen or the hallway apparently doing nothing, and she learned over the years that this was not nothing, that it was a particular kind of preparation, and the wisest thing was to leave it alone. She was right about that, as she was right about most things that required patience. After a few minutes, I walked to the small table by the window. It had been Eleanor's writing table, a narrow wooden piece she had found at an estate sale in Shadyside, sometime in the 1980s, with two shallow drawers and a surface just wide enough to write a letter on which was what she had used it for, until her handwriting made letters impractical. And after that, she used it for other small things. It sits under the kitchen window where the light in the afternoon comes in at a low angle and falls across the surface in a way that is useful for seeing what you are doing. I opened the bottom drawer. Inside, pushed to the back, wrapped in a piece of old flannel that Eleanor had put around it to protect the leather, was a notebook. Small brown, the cover genuine leather that had stiffened somewhat over the decades but had held its shape. On the inside cover in Eleanor's handwriting were the words, "To Walter. Anniversary 1961. For the things worth writing down. I had never written a single word in it. I set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then I stood up and walked into the front room. The bookshelf is along the wall to the left of the door, the same shelf that has been in the same place since the early 1970s, when I built it to Eleanor's specifications from boards I brought home from a job site. The books on it are a combination of hers and mine, and some that were left behind by the children and never retrieved. I ran my finger along the spines in the second from top row, reading the titles in the way you read things you know well, not really looking, but confirming. I found East of Eden in the middle of the row, right where it had been since sometime in 1958. The spine had faded where the light hit it, and the cover was the soft, worn texture of a book that has been opened without being finished. I pulled it down and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The bookmark was still on page 63. I turned to the back of the book, to the last few pages before the end matter, where the pages were loose and unread, and had served for 67 years as a kind of pocket. The folded piece of paper was there, pressed flat by decades of being closed inside a book gone soft at the creases and yellowed at the edges to a color that was somewhere between ivory and old newspaper. I unfolded it carefully, the way you handle something that has been waiting long enough that you owe it some care. On one side, the printed text of a hardware store receipt from the spring of 1958. Lumber, sandpaper, 2 boxes of nails. On the other side, in my own handwriting from 67 years ago, neater than my writing. Now the particular penmanship of a man in his 30s who learned to write in a schoolroom that took it seriously. Fish the Allegheny River. Write something real before I die. See a game at Forbes Field. I read it twice. Forbes Field. I had to think about it for a moment, and then I almost laughed, which is a thing I had not done alone in this house in a long time. Forbes Field had been the home of the Pittsburgh Pirates from 1909 until the summer of 1970, when they played their last game there on a Tuesday evening in June and locked the gates for the last time. The demolition had started the following year. By 1971, 13 years after I wrote that list, there was no Forbes Field to go to. There is a university building there now, and a plaque and a section of the original outfield wall that they kept as a memorial, which is a thing Pittsburgh does with its past, acknowledges it with a marker and builds around it. I had missed that game by 13 years of not getting to it. The other two items I looked at more carefully. Fish the Allegheny River. I had done that 4 days ago. Sitting in a folding chair on flat concrete with bad coffee and a fishing line and a great blue heron that did not catch anything either. The specific fish had been different in my imagination when I was 30 years old, and the folding chair had not been part of it, and there had been someone else in the picture when I had pictured it, though I could not have told you who. But I had done it. That box could be marked. Write something real before I die. I was holding a pen. The notebook was on the writing table. I carried the receipt back to the kitchen table and sat down. I opened the notebook to the inside front cover and tucked the receipt in there between the cover and the first page where it would not be lost again. Then I turned to the first page. The paper was cream-colored and had held its quality over the decades the way good paper does. I did not write for my children. I did not write any dedication to Mike or David or Sarah. I sat there for a moment and thought about who I was actually writing for, and the answer came back the same way it had been coming back since the night I sat in Eleanor's chair. I wrote at the top of the first page for the man who made the list, meaning the 30-year-old on the other side of that receipt, the one who had folded the paper twice and tucked it away, and told himself there was time that later was a real place you could get to, that the things you meant to do would stay meant until you had the capacity to do them. He had been wrong about later. But here we were anyway. I wrote the way I had not written anything in decades, slowly in the hand of a man whose fingers have their own opinions about pace but who does not argue with them anymore. I wrote about the construction crews and the Pittsburgh winters and Eleanor and the 3 children and the house on Perrysville Avenue and everything that had happened in 105 years of being alive in one city. I wrote for 3 hours. I stopped when I reached the bottom of page 4 because what I had written on page 4 required me to put the pen down and sit with it for a while. It had changed the way I understood my own life. I am still at that kitchen table. The lamp over the writing table is low. The tea Eleanor's old cup was holding has gone cold. It is still that same Thursday night, and I want to tell you what I wrote on page 4 because this is where the story changes direction. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way of movies where a realization arrives with music and a close-up and someone saying something memorable into the middle distance. It arrived the way most true things arrive quietly, almost sideways, while I was writing about something else entirely. I had been writing about the list. Not the list itself, I had already written about that in the earlier pages, about the hardware store receipt, and the spring of 1958, and the bookmark on page 63. What I was writing about on page 4 was what the list meant now in light of everything that had happened in the past few weeks. And here is what I wrote. Every single thing on that list, fishing the river, writing something real, sitting still long enough to watch the seasons change I had been doing or trying to do for the first time in the weeks since my 105th birthday. I had treated all of it as new, as things I was finding, as evidence of some late chapter in my life where I was finally becoming someone different or better or more complete. I stopped writing mid-sentence, because what I was describing was not new at all. The fishing had been on the list since 1958. The writing had been on the list since 1958. The sitting still had never needed to be written down, because it was so natural to the man I had been at 30 that it did not even register as an aspiration. It was just what I did on Sunday afternoons before there were children and mortgages and a work schedule, that filled in every available hour with something that needed doing. I had not found these things. I had returned to them. The happiness I had been cautiously, almost suspiciously, beginning to feel over the past weeks, sitting on a bench in Shenley Park, watching leaves fall, drinking bad coffee, at a table full of old people who were glad I was there, sitting on the bank of the Allegheny with a fishing line in still water and a heron that was doing its own work nearby. None of it was new. All of it had been inside me the whole time, unchanged and patient, waiting underneath 60 years of schedules and obligations, and a particular brand of silence I had chosen without knowing I was choosing it. I had not lost it. It had not been taken from me. It had simply been buried, not deeply, as it turned out, but thoroughly. The way something gets buried when you set it down for what you think is a moment, and then never quite find the moment to pick it up again. I did not discover happiness at 105. I remembered it waiting under 60 years of duty and silence and giving. I put the pen down and sat with that for a while. And then I picked the pen back up and wrote something for you. Not for me, I had already written mine. This part is for you, and I mean that exactly because I think there are people listening to this right now for whom what I am about to say is the most important thing they will hear today. Possibly for a long time. You did not lose yourself. I want to say that plainly and without embellishment. Whatever you gave away over the years to your children, your parents, your work, to a marriage or a partnership or a cause or a set of responsibilities that arrived before you were finished figuring out who you were, whatever you gave, you did not give yourself. You cannot give that. You can only set it down. You set yourself down for a moment, and the moment lasted 50 years, and it is still there wherever you put it, waiting with the same patience that my fishing trip and my notebook waited in a hardware store receipt and a locked drawer for 67 years. You are still in there. That is not a small thing. I know it sounds like one. I know it sounds like the sort of thing that gets printed on a card and sent with flowers and means nothing by the time the flowers have gone. But I am 105 years old, and I have been wrong about a great many things in my life. And I am telling you that this is not one of them. You did not lose yourself. You just have not gone looking yet. I closed the notebook at 10 minutes past midnight. I sat in the kitchen in the dark for a while after. Not from inertia, I was not stuck. I was just sitting the way you sit after something has settled, and there is no particular rush to move on from the settling. The house was quiet. It is always quiet in this house after dark. It has been quiet in this house after dark for 6 years, and for the 4 years before that, when Eleanor was very ill, and the kind of quiet that filled the house was the particular quiet of a place where something is being lost gradually. And before that, there were decades of a different quiet, the quiet of one person awake in a house full of sleeping people, which has a fullness to it that I had not understood the value of until it was gone. But the quiet in the kitchen that Thursday night was not any of those quiets. It was the quiet of a room where something has just been understood, where the air itself has settled into a new arrangement. I do not have a better way to describe it than that. I washed the teacup and turned off the lamp and went upstairs holding the railing, taking my time. I slept the way I had not slept in longer than I could remember. Not the shallow, interruptible sleep of a man who is half listening for something, even in his sleep, but deeply the way sleep is supposed to work, the way it does for people who have nothing left unresolved enough to keep them at the surface. When I woke up the next morning, something happened that I had not expected. Something small, the kind of small that does not look like much from the outside, but it changed the rest of everything. The following Tuesday, I went back to Vet's Corner and took my usual seat by the window. The coffee was the same temperature it always was, which is to say approximately the temperature of good intentions. Franklin Dodd was already there, already in the middle of a story, already talking at a volume that suggested he had forgotten the room had walls. This was not unusual. Franklin Dodd in full voice is a particular Pittsburgh phenomenon, loud in the way of a man who spent 30 years in environments where being heard clearly was a matter of professional necessity, and who has never quite recalibrated downward since retirement. Lorraine Hayes was across from him, with her hands around her coffee, and the expression of a woman who is waiting for a factual error in order to deploy a correction she has already prepared. I poured myself a cup and settled in to listen. Franklin had responded sometime in the fall of 1987 to a fire call on what he was describing as East Carson Street on the South Side, which is the commercial stretch that runs along the south bank of the Monongahela River, full of bars and restaurants, and the particular energy of a Pittsburgh neighborhood that has always known what it is and has no plans to change. The problem, and I could see from the expression on Gene's face that he had already identified it, was that the address Franklin was describing. The building the cross street, the neighbors who had come out to watch all of it, was on the north side of the city, on East Ohio Street, which is on the other side of two rivers from East Carson Street, and has nothing in common with it except that both names include a compass direction and the word street. Pittsburgh has a tradition of streets with similar names on opposite sides of the river. The city is built on a triangle of land between three rivers, and then spread outward in every direction from that point, and the naming conventions did not always account for the confusion this would later cause. East Carson and East Ohio are a particular pair. They sound enough alike on a radio dispatch in the middle of the night in a truck going over a bridge to cause a man to remember them incorrectly 38 years later with absolute certainty. Franklin had not noticed that anyone had identified the error. He was building toward his conclusion, which involved a staircase, a structural element, that in my experience tends to appear in a lot of Pittsburgh stories from people who either built them or had cause to respond to emergencies involving them. Lorraine set down her coffee cup. "Franklin," she said, in the tone of a woman who taught elementary school for 31 years and developed across those decades a very specific method of delivering corrections. East Carson Street is on the south side. You're describing the north side. That's East Ohio Street. Franklin stopped. He considered this for approximately 3 seconds, with the expression of a man examining evidence that contradicts a strongly held position. Hemingway said Lorraine continued before Franklin could respond that the only thing worth writing is the truth. She said this in the way she always said things she was attributing to literature with complete confidence and the forward lean of someone citing a primary source. Otis Brewer, who was sitting beside me, and who reads more than any other person at the table, looked up from his coffee with the expression of a man who has an opinion about that attribution, but has learned that some corrections are not worth making before noon. Franklin leaned back in his chair. Hemingway, he said, also drank himself to death, so I'm not sure he's our authority on truth-telling. There was a pause. And then Ruth Caldwell laughed first, the full-body laugh that she does not try to contain, and then Dolores Webb, and then Franklin himself, who laughed the way he always does, from somewhere deep and entirely unself-conscious. The kind of laugh that is an event rather than a response. And I laughed. Not a polite acknowledgement. Not the measured social response of a man who finds something mildly amusing and signals it appropriately. A real one, the kind that starts in the chest, before you have decided whether you are going to laugh, the kind that takes you by surprise, even though you could see it coming, the kind that makes your eyes water slightly, and as it turned out, costs you about 1/3 of a cup of coffee down the side of your hand. I set the cup down and reached for a napkin, and the laughter kept going for a moment anyway, trailing off into something that was mostly breathing. I cannot tell you the last time that had happened. I cannot even estimate it. It had been a very long time. When the table had mostly settled, I looked up and found Gene Kowalski watching me from the other end of the table. He was not smiling. Gene rarely smiles, not because he is unhappy, but because he expresses things through a narrower vocabulary of expression than most people, and has made that vocabulary work for 82 years without needing to expand it. He looked at me with the level assessing quality he brought to most things, and then he gave a single nod. Not greeting me, we were well past greetings. Not acknowledging the joke, something else. It was the nod of a man who has been watching another man for several weeks and has just seen something he was waiting to see and has decided that his assessment was correct. I nodded back. We did not say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said, because some things communicate better across a table without words, especially between men of a certain age who have spent their working lives in environments where words were for giving orders, and everything else happened in the space between them. On the drive back to the north side, I sat in the passenger seat of Harper's Buick and watched the November streets go past and did not say much, which was not unusual. Harper and I had developed a comfortable relationship with the quiet of car rides by that point. It was somewhere on the Veterans Bridge crossing the Allegheny heading north that I realized something. I had not thought about Mike or David or Sarah once during the entire morning. Not a single time. Not when I was listening to Franklin's story, and not when I was laughing at it, and not during the coffee, and not during Ruth's follow-up story about a similar geographic confusion that had once caused one of her students to miss a field trip entirely. I want to be accurate about this. I had not made a decision not to think about them. I had not been disciplining myself or practicing some technique of letting go. They simply had not appeared. The morning had been full of other things, and there had been no gap in it that needed filling with worry or waiting or the particular low-level monitoring that had been the background noise of my days for years. This was different from what I had described in the notebooks on Thursday night. That had been understanding. This was something more like evidence. Harper pulled up in front of my house and left the engine running. She sat for a moment, without getting out the way she sometimes does when something is working its way forward from wherever she keeps things before they are ready to be said. "Walter," she said finally, looking out through the windshield rather than at me. "There is something I have been meaning to give you." I said nothing and waited. "Not yet," she said. "But soon." I asked her what it was. She shook her head once and reached down and put the car back in drive. I got out. She waited until I was up the porch steps and through the front door before she pulled away. I know because I heard the car move only after the door was closed behind me. There was a Wednesday morning somewhere in the last weeks of October, or perhaps it had already crossed into November. I genuinely could not have told you which, and that itself was the point when I realized I had not checked my phone in over 2 hours. I was on the bank of the Allegheny with the fishing rod and the folding chair Harper kept in her trunk, and the phone was in my jacket pocket, and I had not thought about it since we sat down. I reached into the pocket for something else, a handkerchief, as it turned out, and my fingers found the phone, and I pulled it out and looked at it. Nothing, no missed calls, no messages. I put it back. Not the way I used to put it down, face up, visible, available. I put it back in the pocket and went back to watching the water. And I thought about what had just happened. Not the mechanics of it, the not checking, the forgetting, but what it meant and what it would have meant a year ago and what the difference was. A year ago, the phone not ringing had a sound to it. Not an actual sound. Silence is silence. But there was a quality to the silence when the phone had not been looked at in a while. A pressure to it, like an accusation waiting for me to notice it. It meant something. If an hour went by and no one had called, I went through the list. Had I said something wrong the last time? Was something happening that no one was telling me about? Had I become at some point, without realizing it, someone my children called only when they thought to, rather than when they wanted to? The silence of the phone was never just silence. It was information about where I stood with the people who were supposed to be closest to me in the world. That morning on the riverbank, the phone sat in my jacket pocket for 2 hours and 20 minutes. I checked the call log later. the way you check something when you want to be precise. And the silence was not information. It was just the absence of noise in a place where there was already very little noise to begin with. The water. The birds working the shoreline downstream. The sound of the city somewhere behind us muted by distance, and the particular acoustic quality of a river between hills. I had not been waiting for anything. That was the difference. I thought about David while we were sitting there. Not deliberately, he came to mind the way thoughts come when you are doing something physically simple and your mind is loose enough to go where it wants. I tried to remember the last conversation I had with David that was not a phone call with an obligation attached to it. Not a holiday call. Not a call because something had happened. Just talking the way people talk when they are in the same place and have time and nothing in particular pressing on either of them. I could not remember it. I could not put a year to it, or a season, or even a rough decade. I sat with that for a moment, watching the line in the water. A year ago, not being able to remember something like that would have opened into the particular kind of pain that has no clean edges, the kind that you cannot trace to a specific injury, because it accumulated so slowly that you never noticed the original wound. The kind that you press on repeatedly the way you press on a bruise, as though repetition will eventually tell you something the first press did not. Now it was just sadness. A straightforward, uncomplicated sadness of the kind that does not require anything from you, does not require you to do something about it, or understand it, or forgive anyone, or call someone and say a difficult thing. Just the quiet acknowledgement that something had been lost gradually over a long time, and that the losing was real and the loss was real, and the knowledge of it was something you could carry without it determining the quality of your mourning. Sadness and pain are not the same thing. I had confused them for years. Pain demands attention. Pain will not let you be. Sadness will sit with you quietly and not ask much of anything, and if you let it, it will eventually become just another feature of the landscape present, but no longer in the foreground of everything. I could still see my 3 children in the foreground of who I was. They were in there, all 3 of them, in ways that 65 or 70 years of being someone's father tends to put people in the foreground of you permanently and without your permission. I was not someone who did not love them. I was not someone who had decided they did not matter. I had simply stopped requiring their response to know that the love was real. I want to say something directly to you here because I think some of you have spent years telling yourselves a version of this story that is not quite accurate, and the inaccuracy has been costing you. There is a difference between not loving your children anymore and not needing them to make you feel whole. These are not the same thing. The second one does not require the first. You can love someone fully and completely and still reach the point where you do not need them to pick up the phone for your day to have meaning. You can love them and also not allow the question of whether they love you back in the particular way, at the particular frequency, with the particular attention you had hoped for, to be the thing that decides whether you are worth anything on a Wednesday morning in November. That is not distance. That is not bitterness. That is not giving up. That is finally understanding what the love was always supposed to be. Something you give because it is the truth of you, not because of what comes back. I gave it for 105 years. It was still there. It would not stop being there. I had simply stopped requiring it to be reciprocated in a specific way before I was allowed to feel it. The fishing rod moved slightly with the current, and I adjusted my grip, and the morning kept going. That evening, Harper called. She said she was organizing something for the Saturday after next. She would not tell me what it was. I asked twice, and she deflected both times with the particular efficiency of someone who has made a decision about how much information to provide and is not interested in renegotiating. Before she hung up, she said, "Wear the vest, Walter." I held the phone for a moment after the call ended and looked at it. The same phone I had been checking compulsively for years. The same device I had been waiting on for voicemails that came back 3 days late, and calls that lasted 3 minutes with a television in the background. I set it on the side table, face down, not because I was avoiding something, because there was nothing to avoid. Because the Saturday after next was coming regardless, and whatever Harper was organizing would be whatever it was, and the vest was hanging in the closet, and the evening was quiet in the way I had been slowly learning to accept as a gift rather than a sentence. I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea and watched the last of the light go out over Perrysville Avenue. On that Saturday morning, I put on the vest. I made my coffee, stood at the kitchen window a moment out of habit, then opened the back door. 11 people were standing in my yard. None of them shared my last name. Dolores Webb had arrived first with ribs chicken and enough side dishes to fill a canvas bag the size of carry-on luggage. She was already arranging everything on a fold-out table along the back fence, with the authority of someone who arrives first, precisely so she can set things up the way she wants. Mabel Thornton stood beside her holding a tin. Inside, I would discover, was a spiced apple cake. The note on top read, "Happy 105 WM," with a small drawing of a fish beside it. I looked at that drawing for a moment and did not say anything. Vivian Cross looked me over when I came through the door and said I had more color than last month. I told her it was the cold air. She said it was not only the cold air and moved on before I could respond, which is a nursing instinct that does not retire. Gene Kowalski stood near the back fence with his coffee watching the yard. He nodded when he saw me. I nodded back. We had that language down. Ruth Caldwell was at the center of everything, because Ruth is always at the center of everything. She had a folded piece of paper in her hand, and then I noticed the gate. The wooden gate to the alley has had a failing hinge for 2 years. It had listed slightly to one side for so long I had stopped seeing it. Earl Dunning was standing beside it with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the expression of a man who has finished a job and is not intending to make anything of it. The gate was hanging straight. I looked at Earl. He shrugged. Hinge was bad. Had the parts in my truck. That was the complete accounting. I did not push for more. You see what needs doing, you do it, and the less said about it, the better. That is the way of men of a certain background, and I understood it completely. Ruth unfolded the paper and said she wanted to say a few words, which everyone understood to mean she was going to read something she had written at the pace of a woman who spent 31 years waiting for third graders to settle down. Walter Allen Miller, she began, born October 14th, 1922. A pause. 1920, said Clarence. 1920, said Dolores. Franklin said it at his standard volume, which reached the neighbors. Ruth looked up, made a small correction, and continued without breaking stride. 1920. A man who has spent 105 years building things that last. The mark of a good teacher: take the correction, adjust the materials, do not let the revision interrupt the lesson. When she finished, people applauded. Franklin clapped loudest, which is the only way Franklin does anything. Then Otis raised the harmonica. He had not asked. He simply began something low, unhurried, old, in the way of melodies that belong to a whole tradition rather than one song. The yard went quieter, not because anyone stopped talking, but because the talking changed quality. Softer, more considered. The way conversations shift when music enters a room. At some point I looked around the yard. 11 people in their 70s and 80s in their coats and scarves, standing and sitting in the backyard of an old brick row house on the north side of Pittsburgh on a cold Saturday in November. No Mike, no David, no Sarah, and for the first time since birthdays had become something I dreaded, since the quiet house had started feeling like a verdict, their absence was not the largest thing in the yard. It was there. I am not going to tell you I stopped feeling it. But it was in the background. In the foreground were 11 people who had come on a Saturday morning without being asked twice, who had carried food and baked cakes and fixed a broken hinge and brought a harmonica and written a speech with the wrong year in it, because that is what you do when someone is worth showing up for. I understood standing there that I had been operating on a very narrow definition of family for a very long time. When the Pittsburgh cold settled in properly, the kind that drops 5 degrees in an hour at 4 o'clock in November, people began collecting their things. They left one at a time, stopping to hug me on the way out. Not the brief shoulder-level contact of a function. Arms actually around. A second held before letting go. Something communicated that could not fit in a sentence, and both parties knew it. Mabel held on a moment longer than the others, said nothing, and walked down the alley without looking back. Harper stayed. We stood in the yard in the cold and the quiet, and she reached into her coat and took out an envelope. The paper was old, kept carefully yellowed evenly the way ivory yellows. On the front, in handwriting I have known for 62 years, was my name. Before I open that envelope, before you find out what Eleanor actually wrote, type Eleanor in the comments, so I know you are still here. What follows contains some fictional elements woven in for the story. The details may be shaped, but what it says about love, outlasting absence, I believe with everything I have. Still here, Eleanor. Let me see you. I knew Eleanor's handwriting the way I knew her voice. After 62 years, recognition is not something you do, it is something that simply happens before you have decided anything at all. My name on that envelope, written in her hand, stopped every thought I was having. Not slowed them, stopped them. I held the envelope in both hands and did not move. She gave it to me 3 months before she passed. Harper said. She explained Eleanor had come to her door one afternoon, sat in her kitchen, talked for an hour about the neighborhood, the children, 62 years of being married to me. Then she handed over the envelope. Said she had been carrying it and had finally decided to do something with it. There is a postscript at the bottom, Harper said. For me. I think you should read it last. I opened the envelope carefully, the way you open something that has waited a long time and deserves not to be rushed. A single folded page, cream stationery, faint blue rule line, the same paper Eleanor had used for decades. Her handwriting exactly as I remembered it. Not thin or wavering, written when she still had her full strength. I read it. Harper, dear, if you are reading this, then I am gone. And Walter is somewhere alone telling himself he is fine. He does not believe in asking for help. That was the one thing about him I could never fix in 62 years, and I have made my peace with the fact that some things in a person are simply theirs to keep. Please show up at his door on a Tuesday for no reason at all. Bring coffee, it doesn't matter how it is, he will drink it anyway. Let him talk. He has more stories in him than he has ever had anyone sit still long enough to hear. He has more living left in him than he knows. I have always known that about him, even when he did not. All my love, Eleanor. Below the signature in smaller handwriting. P.S. Harper, don't give him this letter right away. Wait. Give it to him the first time he walks to your door on his own. Not when he calls. Not when he needs something. But the first time he comes with no reason except that he has decided to. That will be the day he is ready. E. I folded the page and held it. Otis Brewer was still in the yard. He had not left with the others. He raised the harmonica without asking and began to play something slow, low, old, in the way of melodies that belong to a whole tradition rather than one song. He played softly, facing the middle distance, and the sound went up into the cold air and stayed for a moment before the cold took it. Nobody said anything. I sat down on the porch step and listened and let everything be what it was. Harper had knocked on my door 3 weeks after Eleanor passed. Food in the winters. Conversation over the fence in summers. 6 years of small, consistent presence that I had accepted as ordinary neighborly kindness. I had thanked her appropriately and told myself I did not need it, and never in 6 years knocked on her door first, until the morning after my 105th birthday, when I put on my good suit and stood on her porch for 3 minutes before I knocked. 6 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She told me later when we had moved inside. She had counted. I almost gave it to you twice, she said. Once during the bad winter, and once around David's last birthday. I could hear you weren't sleeping. I asked why she hadn't. Because Eleanor said, "Wait," Harper said. And when you finally knocked, I wanted the moment to be right. Not just a doorstep. Something you would remember. She said it the way you say something when the explanation is also the entire truth. Otis finished. The last note dissolved into the cold. He put the harmonica in his pocket, said goodnight, and walked through the gate, the one with the new hinge, and I heard his footsteps down the alley, and then nothing. Harper sat down on the step beside me. The cold came up through the concrete. Neither of us moved. She had been gone 6 years, and she was still taking care of me. That night, after Harper's headlights swept across the kitchen wall and the yard went quiet, I sat down at Eleanor's writing table. Not in grief. I sat down and opened the notebook and picked up the pen, and I wrote about something I had never before had enough information to understand. I wrote about Eleanor. Not the Eleanor I had been missing was something I had gotten very good at and very tired of. I wrote about the Eleanor who had sat in my neighbor's kitchen in the last months of her life, talked for an hour, handed over a sealed envelope and said, "Wait until he is ready." I went back through it in my mind, the way you go through something when the key has finally been given to you. For 6 years, she had shown up Tuesday knocks. Food left at the door, in winter a word over the fence in summer. I had taken all of it as the ordinary goodwill of a considerate neighbor. Which she is, but which was not, as it turned out, the whole story. 3 weeks ago, she had asked whether I had ever gone fishing on the Allegheny River. I told her I always meant to. She said, "I know." I did not ask how. I understood it now. Eleanor had sat in Harper's kitchen and talked about the hardware store receipt. From 1958, the list on the back, the man she had been married to for 6 decades, who had put down a fishing rod in the middle of his life and never picked it back up. She had told Harper the way she told her everything else, not as instructions, but as the ordinary sharing of a woman who loved her husband very specifically and wanted someone to know the specifics. And the bad coffee. Eleanor had written, "Bring coffee" in the letter, adding that it did not matter how it was, Walter would drink it anyway. She knew this because she had been paying attention for 62 years, and some things simply accumulate into certainty. The bad coffee was not an accident. The Tuesdays were not an accident. None of it had ever been an accident. Eleanor had not been watching from somewhere I could not see. She had been practical in the way she was practical about most things, identified a person she trusted, given her specific instructions, and arranged for those instructions to be carried out in a way that would not feel like instructions to anyone receiving them. That was Eleanor. That had always been Eleanor. I wrote for a long time about the difference between two things that look similar from the outside. The first is clinging, holding on to people because their absence is something you cannot tolerate. I had done this with my children for years, calling, leaving voicemails, measuring my worth in the frequency of their contact, and finding myself diminished by a standard I had set without their knowledge. I told myself it was love. It was something. But it was also need and fear and the confusion that comes from giving so long that you start to believe you are owed something back. The second thing is preparing. Eleanor had not clung. She had not extracted promises from the children. She had looked at the situation clearly with the combination of affection and practicality that had been the operating system of her mind for 62 years, and she had made arrangements. She had prepared me for a life she would not be in. Not by telling me how to live it, by finding someone to show up on Tuesdays with bad coffee and let me talk. The people who love you right do not always stay beside you. But if they loved you right, They find a way to keep showing up even after they are gone. Even when the only tools they have left are a sealed envelope and a neighbor who keeps her word. I closed the notebook at 2 in the morning. I climbed the stairs with both hands on the railing and got into bed. I was asleep within minutes. Not the surface sleep of someone waiting for something deep, complete, without dreams. The sleep of a man who has set something down that he has been carrying for a very long time. Sunday was quiet. I made breakfast, read the paper. In the late afternoon, just before the light left Perrysville Avenue, the phone on the counter rang. I looked at the screen. The name was Sarah. I want to explain carefully what happened when I saw Sarah's name on that screen. Because I know what you are thinking. You are thinking I did not answer out of anger or to teach her something about silence. That is not what happened. I had been on the porch for 20 minutes, sitting in my coat, and the scarf Eleanor knitted in the 90s, holding her mint green teacup in both hands. 35 cents at a strip district flea market in 1974. Used every morning by her until she could not, and every evening by me since. The porch faces west. In November, when the trees have given up their leaves, you can see the sky open up over the Pittsburgh hills, oranges and rose and the pale gray at the line where day stops and evening begins. I was watching that when the phone rang. I went inside. Sarah. Her name in the font Eleanor had set to slightly larger because she knew I would never ask for that myself. I stood there for a moment. Then I went back outside and sat down and watched the sky until the phone stopped. It was not anger. I am not a bitter man. Bitterness closes you off from the world, and the world had just spent 2 months showing me it was considerably more available than I had allowed myself to believe. It was not strategy. I am 105 years old, and I have no patience left for teaching lessons. Here is what it was. For the first time in more years than I can count, I was in the middle of something. Not waiting, not recovering. Actually, in a moment that was happening, the teacup warm in my hands, the sky going orange over the hills, the November cold serious about its intentions. Sarah could call again. This sky would not come back. It would be gone in 7 minutes. I chose the sky. 3 things before I finish, because they are the truest things I know. First, the great loneliness of being old is not the absence of company. It is invisibility, the sense that the world has stopped checking whether you are still in it. That is not a verdict. It is a condition. And it responds to a simple remedy: people who look you in the eye and mean it. They are not as hard to find when you stop waiting for the particular people you had in mind. Second, whatever happiness you think you lost in the decades of raising children and meeting obligations, you did not lose it. You set it down. I went fishing for the first time in 67 years at 105, and the river was still there, and the part of me that wanted it since 1958 was still there too, unchanged. Go get it. Whatever it is not too late. Third, the people who loved you truly do not disappear entirely when they are gone. They leave things behind. Instructions given to neighbors, sealed envelopes with conditions attached. Love does not end. It changes form. Learn to recognize it. My sons still call. I answer. I am warm. I do not keep a running account of what is owed, but I am not waiting by the phone anymore. That is the only thing that changed. And it changed everything. Do not pour your life into cups with holes in the bottom. Find the ones that hold what you give, the people who show up on a Saturday in November with bad food and a wrong year in a speech and a harmonica and arms that actually hold on. And if you have not found them yet, be your own cup first. You have waited long enough. Get up. Go live. If this grandpa story has taught me anything, do not wait the way I waited. Do not measure your worth in missed calls and late birthday cards. I believe God does not place people in our lives by accident. Harper, Eleanor, 11 strangers in a cold backyard in November. Every one of them was there with intention. I simply did not see it for 6 years. This grandpa story is not one I am proud of in every chapter. I spent too many years calling it patience when it was really self-punishment. That is not family justice. True family justice means deciding your life has value regardless of what your children decide. It means not disappearing quietly in a house full of silence. My honest opinion, family justice begins the morning you stop waiting and start living. That is the only morning that counts. Every grandpa story ends. Make yours worth telling. If something here stayed with you, leave a comment. Someone else is sitting alone by a phone right now. Share this if it matters. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements for reflection and education. If that is not for you today, we understand. Come back when you are ready.